We have the distinct pleasure of having Allison Trulock here with NewGen Strategies, and she'll be giving a presentation on commercial recycling case studies. Hello, Allison. And if you'd like to share your screen, that's fine, or I can do it from here, either way.
I will go ahead and attempt to share my screen. Give me 1 second here. Good morning, everyone. Is the PowerPoint up? Can you see that?
Let's see. Not
Yes.
Mine's a little slow.
Yes, we can
Is it
see it.
slow? Okay.
Yep.
So I do have a presentation that I want to go through with everyone today. What I would ask is, because when I'm sharing my screen, I can't really see if people are putting hands up or what's going on over there. So Keith, if you see a hand go up, if you want to interrupt me, or I'd encourage everybody to just take yourself off mute and interrupt me, because we want this to be an interactive discussion today. So I've got a presentation that I'll walk through, and then there are some things that we'll kind of get the group talking about when we get toward the end of the presentation. As Keith mentioned, I'm Allison Trulock with NewGen. I'm the managing partner for solid waste. And I'll just mention too that Caitlin Shulwinski, who is with NewGen as well, is on the call today too. And she's going to jump in and correct me if I get my case studies mixed up. But hopefully I've got it all straight in the presentation, but you may hear from her. And again, please do feel free to jump in and add some comments or ask some questions as I move through the presentation. I thought it would make sense to go ahead and start with kind of a big picture overview on the federal and state initiatives, and then give everybody sort of a snapshot of what's happening in the top 20 largest cities. And then we'll get into those case studies that Keith mentioned, and then we'll wrap up with some of the key takeaways in group discussion. So can everybody hear me okay? And can you see an agenda slide? And Keith, if you can say,
yeah.
Okay. All right, good.
Hear you and see it. Yeah.
All right, perfect. So starting off with just federal and state initiatives, I think you all have heard, but I'll mention it here too, that EPA has published its national recycling strategy. And so this actually got published in November of 21. So the plan's been finalized. They are working on the implementation now, and it's kind of at varying stages. But one of the exciting things is that the bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed last year actually does include funding for recycling infrastructure as well as recycling outreach. They actually just today released a request for information. So there's a couple of websites on this slide, and I think we will make this presentation available to everybody. So there's one if you want to just stay connected on what EPA is up to, and then there's another where you can actually go read the strategy. There's some others where you can volunteer to be on committees for EPA. But one of the bigger initiatives right now that I've been working with SWANA on is trying to provide some useful feedback to EPA on how the grant programs will roll out for both recycling infrastructure and recycling education and outreach. So that's two different grant opportunities that are supposed to be coming out in the fall. I think there's been some delays on, they've been doing public meetings and other things, but we'll see. But by the end of the year, we're expecting these grant programs to roll out. So there is opportunity to weigh in for those of you who want to be a part of making some recommendations to EPA. I think any of us who've been through any federal grants before know that there's room for improvement, right? And how they streamline and how they go about things. So that is going on right now. I'll also mention that for EPA, they've got this broader circular economy initiative going on, and the recycling strategy itself is only one part of, I think, a total of 6 different parts. So what's coming next for EPA is looking at plastic specifically. They've got one on organics and food scraps. I think there's one that's focused on the built environment, so that's where construction and demolition may come into play. But there's a broader picture that EPA is working on just for some federal guidelines and, frankly, hopefully federal funding when it comes to recycling initiatives and creating that circular economy. So again, those websites are available on this slide when you get this if you wanted to sign up to be getting more information on that. The other thing I'll mention that I think has come up in some of these group discussions before is that there had been some talk of a national bottle bill. There were a couple of bills that were introduced. There, as far as I can tell, there hasn't been any action on this since March of 2021. But there had been talk at a federal level to look at the bottle bill. So I wanted to give you guys just a quick snapshot. Again, I think most of you are probably already aware, but we've got 10 states that already have a bottle bill. I know that this slide has really tiny font, but it's, kind of the key takeaways is that Oregon was the first one back in 1971 to implement a bottle bill. There have been others, and the deposit amounts kind of vary between 5 cents and 15 cents for the different containers. You can get information on what those containers are, but Texas is not a state with a bottle bill. This gives you some idea of what those redemption rates are in those states. And I will caution that there's varying ways that this gets measured. There's obviously varying reporting requirements. You can tell from the missing blocks on this slide, but they do try to keep track of what it really means for redeeming those certain types of bottles and containers and, across plastic and glass and metal. And then kind of the last thing on the bigger picture with bottle bill states, this came from the Container Recycling Institute back in 2018, but it gives you that side-by-side comparison of what kind of recovery you can get for, in this case, it's aluminum cans, PET plastic bottles, and glass bottles when you've got a deposit versus when you don't. So again, just kind of big picture at both the federal level and the state level of some initiatives that have been taken on in other parts of the country to try to drive up the recovery of these materials. One more kind of bigger picture thing I want to walk through is the 3 more recent EPR packaging states. So Maine was the first one that actually passed an EPR bill for packaging that happened in July of 21. And they're defining producers as the producer of packaging. So this would apply to like Amazon, Walmart, any kind of brand owners. The idea behind this is that those brand owners would be paying into a fund, and then that fund would help fund the local government recycling programs. In Maine, they've actually just started the specific rulemaking, so there's a lot of detail we don't know yet of how this will shape up. In certain provinces in Canada, they've had this approach for a long time, and there's been kind of mixed reviews. I think the packaging manufacturers have said, hey, why don't you let us just handle recycling because we can do it more efficiently. So there's been some pushback on actually paying in, but I think in Canada, for the most part, I think it's been viewed as successful as a funding source to keep those recycling programs going. Although, there are pluses and minuses. So Maine was the first one to get this going. Those payments wouldn't even start until 2026 and be paid out in 27. So I don't know if we can say yet how successful they're going to be in the US, but Oregon followed suit soon after. So January of 2022 is when Oregon passed their, they call it the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, but it essentially sets up that same kind of packaging responsibility. So in their case, they're going to start implementing it in 2025. And their bill also establishes some new requirements for MRFs. So they're trying to sort of bring some consistency across the state as far as what kinds of materials could be recycled. And they've also got a truth in labeling task force. So they're kind of wanting to make sure that what we label on the packages is accurate for what can actually be recycled. And then they want some consistency across the MRFs. So this is another one that just happened fairly recently and hasn't fully rolled out yet, but we'll certainly keep an eye on that. And then while we were actually doing research on this, Colorado passed their extended producer responsibility for packaging. So this had been, it actually just went through the legislature a couple of days ago. So it has been approved. So this one is brand new. And so those are the only 3 states in the US that actually have this broader EPR for packaging, with the idea being that the product manufacturers will help fund the recycling programs in the state. This one, again, they won't really get started as far as, money paying in and money paying out until 2024 or 2025. But I thought it was at least worth a mention that we do have some states that are now passing these statewide EPR laws that focuses on the packaging industries. And one more quick slide here. This graphic is across the US, the states that have some kind of EPR law. So what the Product Stewardship Institute was saying in 2019 is really any state, like you can see that Texas is one that indicates it has one, and that's lead acid batteries. So what's pretty common in a lot of states is to have some kind of EPR specifically for the more hazardous materials or, things that we just need to be careful about how we manage. So on the left-hand side, you can see the list of kinds of things that can end up with a specific, we can call it an EPR law, to be responsible with what happens with those materials. Texas is on the list, like I said, for lead acid batteries. For some of these communities, it's paint or electronics. So there's kind of a variety of things, but there's only 16 states in the US that don't have some kind of EPR bill for at least one material. So that on the different state and federal initiatives, are there any comments or questions before we get into specifically talking about cities?
Allison, this is Mike. You talked about states having specific requirements for material recovery facilities.
Yes, in Oregon, yeah.
What type, are they looking at standardization of those facilities, or?
That's exactly right. I'm going to back up to that Oregon slide. What they're doing is, and they're kind of studying all this at this point, Mike. So this law, passed earlier this year. The bill itself has requirements for the MRFs to create that statewide collection list. So the intent is to standardize it, but at this point, it's more everybody's studying what exactly this would mean. So I believe in Oregon, the MRFs would have opportunity to weigh in on this, but it would be trying to get to a place where, and I know this has come up in this group before, that every community may have its own, even what they consider contamination. It kind of depends on what the facility can process. So what Oregon wants to do is make it standardized across the entire state. And that would also obviously make it easier on the education and outreach, that if everything is consistent across what these MRFs in the state can process, that would allow every city within the state to say, okay, these are the materials that are in our program more consistently throughout the state.
Thanks. And go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it, in theory, this makes a lot of sense. I think we've had some discussions already with this group and in other conversations of what the challenges in this could be. But it'll be interesting to watch how Oregon can standardize across all the MRFs in the state. Did you have a follow-up there, Mike?
Yeah, just wanted to ask, in the state of Texas, what kind of development is happening for other materials other than lead acid batteries? Is there any discussion of other materials?
Yeah, and I know what I didn't have on that slide is, we were just kind of focused on EPR, but the state legislature did say that they wanted to do more in economic development as well. And I'd open that question up to the broader group as far as whether steps have actually been taken, because I know that was, I think in 2020, right, that there was a bill that passed that was really trying to bring the economic development side to recycling in the state. So is there anyone else that's got anything to add on Texas in particular beyond what we are calling an EPR law on lead acid batteries? That's a really good question, Keith. And I know we had made mention in the plan that the state had taken some of those legislative initiatives recently, or at least put it on the books that, hey, we need to focus on this. We need to do more in this arena. I've not heard any updates of specific actions that have been taken.
Great, thanks.
Okay. All right, so we'll get into some city information. So just looking at the top 20 largest cities. We've got the top 10 on this slide. I've got 11 through 20 on the next. This just kind of gives everybody a snapshot of what is going on out there when it comes to, we've got both multifamily and commercial covered in this. Some communities consider multifamily commercial. Some communities consider it, a separate kind of residential service class. But essentially what you're looking at here are the ones that have some kind of mandatory multifamily recycling program, some kind of mandatory commercial, a voluntary service that the city might offer, and then offering some kind of technical assistance. And sometimes those technical assistance programs also have recognition programs involved. So we just took a quick look at the top 20 most populated cities to see what was going on. So you can see in the top 10, every city has something to do with it, at least technical assistance. They aren't completely not involved in commercial, but when we look at the 11 through 20, you'll see that there actually are some larger communities that have nothing to do with commercial recycling at all. So I thought that was just interesting to note that while a majority of the top 20 do something, whether it's mandatory or voluntary, there are some that are not currently doing anything at all on the commercial recycling side. And with that, I want to get into the case study. So we took kind of a deeper dive into 6 different communities. And I'll mention too that there is a report that we will make available. We're actually still trying to interview a couple of communities to see if there's more anecdotal information we can add to that report. But I think we'll have both this PowerPoint and that report available to the groups. You can look into more details on these case studies if you're curious about it. We'll start with Austin. So Austin does have a universal recycling ordinance, and that covers both commercial and multifamily. And it requires the responsible party, so that would either be the business owner or manager or the apartment complex manager, to submit annual diversion plans. So every year, those entities are reporting back to the city. There's also a commercial organics diversion program that requires any food permitted business to submit a plan, again, every year. And I'm kind of making that distinction on Austin because it was, as we go through these case studies, who's reporting and how they're reporting kind of varies. And that's what I'm hoping when we get to the end of the presentation, we can have a group discussion about what seems reasonable on reporting requirements. Another thing that Austin does is they have the Green Business Leader Program. So this is more of a technical assistance and recognition program. So this is not part of the mandatory, but it's just one more thing that Austin is doing on the recycling side for businesses, and then multifamily as well. And because they've got all of the, reporting requirements in there, I think what's interesting to see on this slide, you can see that from 2018 to 2019, the tons reported as diverted, either recycled or organics diverted, really shot up. From 19 to 20, it really came back down. I think the reason for this is the lockdowns, that people were not at their commercial places of business. So everything kind of shifted from being commercial tons to being residential tons. But it gives you an idea of the kind of recovery that they're getting from the commercial entities that are reporting back to the city. In Fort Worth, they've got a multifamily recycling mandate, and then they do not mandate commercial, but they offer technical assistance on the commercial side. So in Fort Worth, they're providing a list of the authorized haulers to landlords and businesses. They do assist the landlords with their recycling plan. So that is something that everybody has to submit to the city, but it's not an annual thing. It's something they've got to do at least once to show that they've got a plan to do the recycling at the multifamily complexes. And then they provide incentives on the commercial sector. So they're using essentially their permitting of their haulers in the city in order to spread access to recycling and kind of promote recycling. And they're trying to gather more information on recycling on the commercial side. And like I said, that's not mandated in Fort Worth. They've also done green breakfasts. And so that's is kind of a way to promote the companies that are doing more sustainable things, and kind of gives them some recognition. And then also is sort of a teaching moment for those people who would go on the tour. And then they host Business Smart workshops for the area businesses. And again, it goes beyond just recycling. It's all kinds of sustainable practices, and have that recognition program through Business Smart. So in Fort Worth, it is mandated for multifamily. It is not mandated for commercial, but they do things to try to promote commercial recycling. As far as measuring the tons or the weight, that's not something that is easily tracked. But we were able to find some data on the multifamily and who's in compliance versus not. So 67% of their multifamily complexes do have an established recycling plan. 16% of them have opted out. So there is a way in the ordinance that you can opt out if it's just going to be impossible for you to set up a recycling program. And then they've got 17% that are still non-compliant. So in this situation, it does take some staff time to be out there working with the multifamily complexes, and working toward compliance across all the multifamily entities. San Antonio was another one that we looked at, and here again, they've got mandatory on multifamily, but it's voluntary on the commercial side. And here again, that it does take staff time. They do on-site inspections to make sure they're in compliance. And in this case, it's haulers that have to submit a report. So in Fort Worth, it's the actual complexes that submit a recycling plan. In San Antonio, it's the haulers that are reporting annually to the city to let them know how many complexes they are providing recycling services to. But there again, the tonnage data is not being tracked. And then on the commercial side in San Antonio, that is a voluntary program, but they do offer technical assistance. So they'll come out and give an on-site consultation. They do the waste assessment to kind of figure out what recycling programs might make sense. And then they also can do some training for employees to be able to have that effective recycling program. And then they've got a program called Reworks San Antonio, and that's an online reward program. So again, some recognition for the businesses who are doing the right thing. You can see the logos for the recycling certified. This program has since expanded beyond just recycling and includes other sustainability initiatives like energy efficiency, that kind of thing. So it's a broader sustainability program now, but it actually started in the recycling world in San Antonio. So here again, we were able to get at 97% compliance among their multifamily entities within the city. Only 3% that are non-compliant, but it was very difficult. We were not able to find any kind of tonnage data that's tracking it. I think one interesting thing to note with San Antonio, that when we had a conversation with the city, the point was made that the multifamily mandatory ordinance, kind of the intent behind it was really about making sure that multifamily residents have access to recycling just like single family. So the point of this was not necessarily about let's get our tonnage up, let's make sure we have a high recycling rate citywide. The point of it really was to make sure that multifamily has access. So it was about expanding access more than it was about targeting a whole lot of tons to be able to get a recycling rate up based on weight. Okay, we're going to leave Texas for a minute and head over to Mecklenburg County / City of Charlotte. It's kind of a joint government entity there. So they also have a source separation ordinance. It's been in place for a long time. In this example, they focus on businesses that are generating more than 16 cubic yards of trash per week, or if they've got more than 500 pounds of cardboard or paper a month, that they're required to recycle those items. But this SSO applies to the businesses that are large enough that there would be some critical mass on the recycling. Small businesses are actually exempt from the SSO, but they can sign up for a recycling service to be able to recycle all the same items that a resident can recycle. So the last kind of things that we could measure is that it's affecting about 6,000 businesses in Mecklenburg County. And here again, their staff is having to go out and do site visits, and they've been able to visit about 1,000. So they do go out there and try to make sure there is compliance and offer that technical assistance. But obviously, when it takes staff time, that's, you got to have enough staff to get out there and be able to look at all of those different programs. Another thing that I thought was just interesting to note, this is actually at the state level, not specific to Mecklenburg County, but the state has what they call the ABC recycling law. This has also been on the books for quite a while, and it's essentially a ban on materials that from going into a landfill. But it's anybody who holds essentially a liquor license or any kind of alcohol vendors, they are required to have some kind of separate, some kind of recycling program for those beverage containers. So this is affecting about 18,000 commercial alcohol retailers in the state. So sort of relates back to what we were talking about earlier at a state level. But again, this has been on the books in North Carolina for quite a while. City of Orlando, they fairly recently have implemented a mandatory commercial and multifamily recycling ordinance. So similar to Austin, it covers both commercial and multifamily. They did a 4-year phase in. So in 2019, it was really focused on any new construction or substantial renovations that as they were, they would have to accommodate recycling. And as part of getting their certificate of occupancy, they'd have to prove they had a recycling plan in place that they'd be ready to recycle. I think in 2020, it moved on to kind of the really big, if it was more than 250 units on multifamily, more than I think 200,000 square feet on the business side. So that the second year they moved to the really big businesses or multifamily complexes. Third year it was, slightly more than that. And then by 2023, they want everybody in compliance with the mandatory commercial and multifamily recycling. I think the thing that's interesting to note about the Orlando case study is that they really promoted the program as economic development. So they do have a sustainability office. They do have a zero waste to landfill by 2040 goal. But to promote these programs, it was really promoted as an economic development stimulator. So just as we're thinking through, for the city of Houston, if we're going to consider anything mandatory, we'll think through, what are all the different reasons to do it? And in Orlando, economics was one of their reasons. They also have a voluntary commercial food waste recycling program. At this point, I think they've got maybe 25 businesses that have signed up for it, and the city will bring them carts. The city actually does do the residential collection with carts, so they already have the equipment to be able to go collect from these carts and get that material. It's either composted or some of it's going to anaerobic digestion, but getting it diverted from landfilling. So, and here is the 4-year phase in that Orlando went through. So that first phase was all the new developments. The second phase was the larger either multifamily or commercial properties. Phase 3 was, not quite that big, but larger. And then phase 4, again, they're aiming for about a year from now to have everybody in compliance, both multifamily and commercial properties.
Allison, just a quick question on that economic development stimulator. Were those soft credits as in, hey, this is just going to be better for our city and help us bring in more businesses? Or was it like, here are actual, dollars and cents that they could put to it as to how it's economically, improving the economy by installing these recycle programs?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think part of the promoting of even doing, the recycling side of things is some of what we see in other communities where it's promoting that, hey, you can reduce your waste bill if you recycle this. And so I know that becomes a bit of a challenge when you're looking at tipping fees for the disposal facility versus the tipping fees at a processing facility. But I think some of it was showing the kind of savings and just cutting down on that. So the individual businesses could see an immediate benefit, but beyond that, the second part of, I think, really your question is that this can, you're creating jobs as you are diverting material away from landfills. I think it was in the, I'm trying to remember the right entity that I'm about to quote here, but there was a study done that showed that for every, I think it was 10,000 tons of waste that is managed, it creates 6 jobs. For every 10,000 tons of recyclables or some material being diverted, it creates 36 jobs. So being able to kind of demonstrate that this can be an economic stimulator, even if it isn't right in this case, Orlando, that around that area, there could be job creation as part of that too. But I'm writing down that point because I think it's one we may want to get more detail on in Orlando. And because I do think that may have applicability to Houston, is just what else they were doing as far as the economic development stimulator. And Caitlin, I know you're on. If you have any more detail to add from Orlando, please chime in.
I was going to see if I could find the report, and if I can, I'll paste it in the chat.
Okay, yeah, just to get some more detail on what exactly they were doing. And that'll be a good follow-up thing that we can bring back to the group as well, just to have some clarity there. Very good question, though. Thank you. All right, and let's move to the other side of the country in Seattle. So in Seattle, Washington, they've had a mandatory commercial recycling ordinance for a really long time. They've got a zero waste resolution that happened in 2007, and then a zero waste strategy in 2010. The other thing I'll say about Seattle is they've got a few different transfer stations. They have a lot of infrastructure, and they have several programs. So they've got an EnviroStars program, and that's basically the technical assistance to Seattle businesses, and also a recognition program. They do allow commercial self-hauling to their transfer stations free of charge for recycling. And then they have a limited cart recycling service they can offer to smaller businesses as well. They Also have a commercial compost collection program where businesses that generate food waste or compostable paper are required to subscribe to a composting service, or again, they could self-haul it to one of their transfer stations. So they are mandatory on the commercial recycling and on the organic side if you're a business that generates food waste or compostable paper. On the construction and demolition side, that's also where they require salvage assessments. You know, I think there's size limits on this. You know, it's not every single time somebody's pulling a permit, but if it's a large enough project, you do have to have a salvage assessment and a plan for how you're going to recycle or, you know, kind of repurpose as much of the demolition or construction debris as you can. And then they've got to submit that report to the city after they complete the project. As part of their waste diversion report, they've got to prove what they actually did. So they first have to assess what they think they can do, then they've got to do it, and then they've got to show the city what they did. So in 2020, they estimated 64% of all the C&D materials were managed for recycling and beneficial use at a certified facility to do that. So they do have a lot of reporting involved. They are tracking it, and they're seeing about a 64% diversion rate. And then multifamily recycling and composting, they work with the multifamily properties to ensure that recycling and composting are accessible. So again, everybody's got to have these programs made available. The city is checking to make sure they're available. And then they do have a volunteer program in the multifamily to champion recycling. So they call it Friends of Recycling. I've seen this in some other communities where they call it a green team, or, you know, they have different names for it. But I think, you know, any multifamily program, for it to be successful, you need people on site that are really promoting it and kind of helping their neighbors understand what they need to be doing. The table at the bottom, so Seattle really does track the tons. So this was another one we were able to get some information on what their recycling and diversion has been. So we went back to 2000. So that was before they actually implemented any of the mandatory. And you can see where the commercial recycling rate was at 48%, multifamily was at 18%. Then in 2010, so this is after they started implementing the mandatory stuff and had a zero waste goal, they got up to 59% in commercial, 30% in multifamily. And then in 2020, so after their zero waste plan initiatives had started taking effect, they got up to 62% for commercial and 37% for multifamily. So I think, you know, another way to look at it, between 2010 and 2020, that doesn't look like as huge of a jump for all of the work that they're doing, but it is, you know, moving in the right direction for Seattle with all of these different initiatives to mandate the recycling and the organic side of things. So let me wrap up with a couple of slides on key takeaways, and then I do want to get into the group discussion, and I'm going to I need to switch the view on this so I can see everybody, because I'm still blind to everybody. So let me run through the key takeaways on this. Of the 20 most populous cities, 35% have both mandatory multifamily recycling and commercial recycling programs. Half of them have some kind of technical assistance. This might be in addition to a mandatory ordinance or instead of. 20% of them don't have any kind of mandated recycling or any kind of technical assistance. So that kind of sums up the 20 most populous cities. I think one of the key takeaways across all of these is that measuring success in commercial recycling is particularly challenging. I think that what we hear from private haulers is they maybe don't want to tell you how many tons or who their customers are because they don't want their competitors to know. So something I hope the group will talk about is if we end up recommending for Houston to do anything like this, to have the reporting, to be able to know the tons, there may be a way to have some kind of non-disclosure element so that the city gets the information and maybe only reports it out aggregated and can keep that, what haulers might consider proprietary. So I hope that will come up in our group discussion, but it was a common theme. You know, Austin and Seattle were the only two where we could actually get to good tonnage data, and they've got pretty heavy reporting requirements to do that. The other communities we talked about, there's no one keeper of all of that data. So it's a challenge when the private sector needs to be actively involved in helping to get all of the material collected, to also keep city-specific data on tonnage. Because another issue could be if they're picking up from businesses in one city and then crossing into another jurisdiction in the same load. So that can be another complicating factor when we're trying to keep track of the tons that are getting collected within one specific jurisdiction. Few more key takeaways. Several of the cities have simplified data collection by digital form. So, the screenshot here is what Orlando does, and this is how, businesses can kind of sign up and get some help that they need, and then show that they're actually doing their recycling. And here again, I'm repeating that the sustainability initiatives, economic development, and zero waste goals were all different motivators that were used for these different communities. So there can be a lot of reasons for taking steps toward more robust commercial and multifamily recycling. So the last point here is just combining those solid waste initiatives with other kinds of existing strategic priorities can help expand that support. So I know in Houston's case, there's a climate action plan. There's also a resiliency plan. And then, Mike and I both worked on the solid waste plan. So there's a few different plans. We were aware of those other plans. So we made sure that we were not contradictory and could kind of, look across those different plans to make sure that everybody's kind of speaking in the same way when it comes to resource recovery. But I think that's just another important element to keep in mind, that there could be other initiatives to be thinking about and sort of tacking this onto, or putting it in the same context as some other things that any one of these jurisdictions is already talking about. So what I was hoping to do with the group, and this is where I want to stop sharing it that way. Okay, now I can see everybody again. So when I was sharing the PowerPoint in a presentation mode, I couldn't see anyone. So I'll leave up the slide here, but what I was hoping to do with the group is kind of talk through, I've got the topic of mandatory recycling, and then the next slide is just on technical assistance in the recognition program. But I really want to hear from everyone in the group on this, and then especially if any of our private haulers are in the meeting this time around, kind of what you all are thinking. So I've laid out on this slide with whether they do multifamily or commercial. If it's one or the other or both, you can get some idea of which communities are doing both or one or the other. Maybe let's start there. Does anybody have any comments on mandatory in general, and then mandatory for multifamily versus commercial?
I'll start. This is Chris with Moonshot Compost. We are operating in Houston, and we just started operating in Austin as well. We collect from residential and commercial businesses. We tend to think at this early stage where we're trying to kind of lead cultural change around food waste, and that's what we focus on predominantly. This is the only recyclable. Commercial is great. They're large generators of waste, or larger per stop. Multifamily is complex. It requires getting a lot of people on board, getting people focused. A lot of people don't really care about it. So we provide under contract services to different multifamily in Houston right now, and the uptake rate is very, very low, very, very low. So when I'm thinking about trying to solve a problem, measured in thousands of tons of waste, commercial seems like the low-hanging fruit, and multifamily seems like something good to also be doing, but I don't think it would have the same impact.
I appreciate that. And let me back up a little. Do you think mandatory is even the way to go? You mentioned that, trying to kind of get the mentality change happening, that there are communities that maybe start with just technical assistance and see how that goes, and then maybe move to mandatory somewhere down the road. Are there opinions in the group on whether mandatory is something to look at in the short term, or is there any thoughts that that's maybe something you look at further out?
It sure seems like incentive over mandatory is better. One of the mantras we have is a smaller clean stream is better than a larger contaminated stream. And when you give people receptacles to put waste or recyclables in that don't care about the waste or the recyclable and how it's going to be categorized, you start ending up with contamination issues. So, to the extent we can continue to think creatively about incentive structures to provide people, we keep trying to push the incentives back to the people that are actually doing the source separating, which is why commercial is nice, because you're dealing with the people that are doing the source separating. So if we're doing multifamily, I'd like to think creatively about how you incentivize the people in the apartments or in the condos or the townhouses. How do you incentivize them to do a good job of source separating. And creativity and solutions around that, I think, would go a long way towards maintaining clean streams. Because one of the things we're able to do is work with compost facilities that historically haven't loved taking food waste because our contamination rates are so low. And because of that, we're able to grow quickly. If our contamination rates were higher, it would be harder for our business.
Mhm. Good point. Others have thoughts on incentives, carrots versus sticks.
Hey, Allison, just a quick question to build off of that. I mean, all of the examples you gave were either with or without ordinances, but there really were no examples, and maybe you have them and just didn't share them in this presentation of, incentive programs that either, that have been successful versus an ordinance. Do we have those types of examples across the country?
Well, some of these case studies, they do have, recognition programs. So I think when it comes to incentivizing a business to do it, what a local government has, what I've mainly seen are those kinds of recognition programs. That if it's, it is voluntary to be a part of that, and that to be able to show what they're doing if it matters to their customers. I'd be curious if the group has other thoughts of, what can a local government do to incentivize that behavior, so that you don't have to mandate it. Because I really haven't seen anything from a local government beyond that recognition program and technical assistance as far as how a local government could affect that. There's always talk of potential like tax incentives, right? Or those kinds of things, which I think it's really tricky. But it may be worth putting that on the table, that if there is some kind of economic development angle to all of this, for Houston, that we maybe need to look into. I don't know of any communities that have been able to actually go that path. I've heard the conversations come up about tax incentives for really on the side of a business that is going to do the recycling or is going to use it as an end, they'll be the end user of a product that they, communities that want to have a resource recovery park or something like that, that they can give tax breaks to attract the businesses who can actually use the recycled content. But I can't think of any that have actually done it. I only know there's been talk of it. Anybody else have thoughts on incentives beyond maybe tax incentives? I'm just trying to think of what a local government could actually do to incentivize beyond the recognition programs. See how challenging that is?
Yeah. And I would say, just to weigh in again, if you're thinking about mandatory, it feels like it's a better result to start with mandatory on commercial rather than mandatory on multifamily, only because of how hard multifamily is. I think it's easier, again, for other types of commercial than multifamily.
Yeah, and I think to the point that you were making earlier, even on the recycling side, when you're making someone do it, they may not do it as carefully as if they voluntarily did it, right? So the contamination issue, I think that, just sort of, I know you were talking about food scraps, but I think that is another thing to at least consider on the mandatory side for commercial is if you're making them do it, are they going to do it right?
This is Mike. Rob or Chuck, do you have any anecdotal information about communities that, for the commercial side, have requirements that haulers at least provide that service? Not necessarily that the businesses have to take it up, but that they've got access to that service.
When I'll chime in there, Mike, that I know there are like franchise agreements that will require their hauler to offer it without necessarily requiring the businesses to take it. So I do think if in a case where you've got, those are exclusive franchise agreements that I'm thinking of. I don't know if you were thinking even just non-exclusive or just a permitting process. I know in the example, I think it was in Fort Worth, that is one of the things they do, that they don't mandate commercial recycling, but through their permitting process of haulers, they are using those haulers to kind of promote recycling and to find out what is going on in the commercial world, like how many of your customers are even signing up for commercial recycling collection. I don't know that they make them do that, but they are using their haulers in Fort Worth to try to gather information on the commercial side.
Yeah, Rob here. I would say in addition to that, Allison's right. I think the next piece of that, though, is that the business owners are told that they're essentially paying for it through taxation or however those charges come through from the municipality. And then behaviorally, we actually see that prompts them to participate. You know, they have an inherent, hey, we're paying for this anyways. It's then it becomes not a choice, and they choose to start participating in a better way.
Okay.
Okay, Richard, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, this is Richard Johnson with Rice University, and this is a question. Actually, maybe I'll direct it to Chris with Moonshot. What if the incentive from the city wasn't necessarily to, you know, the multifamily property owner or the commercial property, but what if it was in the direction of the hauler? You know, I know that you're able to make compost collection work with Rice because we have such an aggregation of scale, but there comes a point where the scale gets small enough to where, you know, it's not worth your while to drive the truck an extra few miles to pick up from somebody. But what if there was something that changed that threshold a bit, that allowed you, you know, or someone like you to, you know, to pick up more customers and therefore have more incentive to reach out to, you know, other scale properties. I just like to hear your thoughts about what if the incentive were to the haulers and not to the property owners.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, some sort of subsidy or something like that helped, you know, defray costs. You know, a question we get all the time, we got it just yesterday in a sales meeting, is, you know, what's in it for me? So, you know, an institution or organization is ready to start food waste diversion, food waste recycling, but they're like, so this is just another cost? Like, what's in it for me? And, you know, our answer to that is dependent on who we're talking to. But a lot of times we have to coach them through the benefits and to think about it just a little less financially. So, I mean, I take your point that, and I don't know what that would look like, but if there was some sort of subsidy that haulers got for, you know, tied to new customers and where they're located or something like that, to encourage us to extend services beyond just the common corridors or something like that. I don't know. That's an interesting question, but it comes back to the city having to spend more money, which is often very difficult, I think, to, especially here where, you know, there's already a shortfall for solid waste.
That's a really, really interesting point, though. And I know that I think it's San Jose, California, and it's probably in a few places in California where their agreements with their hauler, which are exclusive agreements, incentivizes like, hey, hauler, if you sign up X number of businesses, they kind of tie it to like renewal options in the agreement or some kind of bonus structure within an agreement. That's the only thing I've seen that's, you know, kind of a carrots and sticks that was put upon the hauler was all through, you know, an exclusive franchise agreement. I wonder if that same kind of idea could be applied somehow, even if you're just kind of permitting non-exclusively whoever's collecting within the city, though. It's a really interesting thought.
I'd like to weigh in here. This is Denise with Denali and New Earth. Our whole business model is I'm actually over Texas municipal and industrial sales, which means I go target the big food producers, and we will take that material either to composting or we'll take it out to land apply or even to area pig farms or horses, or, you know, that horse is probably a good example, but cattle and those kinds of things. So there is a fairly big, and what we try to do in the pricing is be priced just under landfill costs to provide that incentive for them to come to us to divert things out of the landfill. So there are private effort to do things like that. So I wanted to throw that in there as we're talking about other kinds of incentives.
Yeah,
One
that's a
way
really good point.
we're out there trying to do that, but do it to keep it out of the landfill by being just charge a little less.
Mhm. That's a very good point. So I think we've talked through some ideas of, not the mandatory, but on the incentive side, if we were to look at mandatory, what are your reactions on who would be doing the reporting? Because we had some examples where it was up to the business owners or the landlords to report, other examples where it was up to the haulers to report. We know there's a challenge for the haulers in tracking tons accurately and maybe not even wanting to give up that information. But what are your thoughts there as far as if there was something mandatory, how would you track it? Who would the burden be on to be reporting back to the city? I noticed the haulers are not speaking up, so they probably want the businesses to do the reporting, right?
Well,
This is Chris
yeah,
Moonshot.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna respond to the call out there. I mean, I just don't know how, sure, preference would be there to some degree, but I also don't know how they would do it, right? Because it's gonna be by cubic yard for them. Okay, our container was 6 yards out of 8 full, but that doesn't give you by weight, which is the world we live in. So it could be on us, no problem. Proprietary to a degree, but not, that in my opinion, that's that data would be owned by the hiring municipal. I mean, they're the ones, they're the customer, essentially paying us for that service. So no problems here. I just think we got to figure out, like anything, it's an economic equation. Are we getting paid to run dedicated routes for that stuff? And as such, that's easy. Or do we all say, hey, there's a cost to put tipping scales on the truck, ones that we want to rely on and can rely on and are calibrated regularly, and the cost of that extra sensor and equipment, and then the cost to upkeep it, gets paid for obviously by the customer, but we can compile data that way if it's a commingled route. But openness, I mean, from my perspective, and I'm sure my peers in the industry would be the same. I mean, we're about customer and municipal solutions here.
Yeah, and I
And
think,
this-
oh, go ahead.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we're a younger company, and we view the data angle as being instrumental in motivating our customers' participation in these non-required programs. And so we create a lot of data and share it, and we try to share it in the most interesting ways we can think of doing it. So we've got dashboards that are publicly available that we share with our customers about all the weights that they're diverting already. So that's kind of the way we are approaching the business right now, just in the narrow sliver that we're in, and that's a very different space than the larger haulers that are dealing with more varied waste streams and larger trucks.
This is Chuck with Waste Management. Just a couple of thoughts. We're more than happy to participate and provide whatever service is requested. Our one concern is we don't want to become an enforcement arm on the behalf of a municipality. That's not our business. We're not in the business of enforcement, but a lot of times when these mandatory rules are put in, it seems easy. Let's just say, well, we'll just put it on the hauler and we'll make the hauler responsible to do this. They'll just do it. And as Rob said, okay, fine, if that's what you do. And here's the big if you do that uniformly all the way down the line, if you don't just pick out the top 10 haulers in the market area and say, well, I'm going to enforce it on them because they're easy to enforce to. It's easy to find Republic trucks. It's easy to find Waste Management trucks. But what about, Keith, how many haulers are licensed to haul in the city of Houston right now? 100, 110? How many of that 110 are not paying the fees to the city every year? There's a few, okay? There's a few. We pay ours, and Republic pay ours because we get audited all the time. But every time we get audited and I say, did you audit hauler number 63, 64? How much did they pay? So we've got this world where we have to compete in, where we're being an enforcement agency, but the enforcement agency part is not being uniformly applied to all the haulers. So we got this whole small world of people that avoid the cost and avoid the implications. And that sounds a whole lot like crybabying and whining, and I apologize. I'll take that back. But you know, like Rob, we'll do whatever we can to help. We just need it to not be a burden on a couple of big companies because they're just easy targets.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And I think the thing that was going through my head as you were talking is that if the haulers are just saying, okay, here are the businesses that we provide the service to, then the city has a chance of knowing which ones are not signed up. But it would take every one of those haulers you just mentioned to actually report that. And I mean, it would be a big administrative task, but it would be, instead of asking the hauler to go enforce it, it would give the city the information they need to know where they need to go focus their outreach efforts. And I think, oh, Mark, I've got, you see your hand is up, right? Am I seeing that right? Please,
Yeah,
Mark.
yeah, I was multitasking, but listening to everything. I came on during midway through your presentation, so good presentation. But I think the cities or the municipalities have to get involved with that enforcement piece of it. No doubt about it. That's what code enforcement officers are for, you know, and they should be a little bit more involved in depth in doing those audits. And like Chuck said, you know, you make sure the person on the top of the list is paying those franchise fees or whatever they're required to pay, just as you would, you know, the 99th person on the list as well. So I think that's the part of the enforcement, I believe, is what the city should control. And then I believe the hauler should be able to feel comfortable coming to the city and saying, hey, you know, that you might need to look at this area over here. And then the city should be able to address those and make sure that the playing field remains level. That's my 2 cents.
Yep.
Those are good 2 cents. That's a good 2 cents. That's 2.5 cents. Okay.
Yeah.
Chuck or Rob, have you dealt with any communities that you would say have, you know, as we're looking at, and this is short of a mandatory program, but data collection models that seem to work fairly well for you in terms of keeping that data, you know, the proprietary stuff taken care of, as well as collecting good data?
I need to reach out to other people in my organization that have a broader exposure. I've had some general discussions with our folks in Austin and San Antonio and Fort Worth, where we're very, very aggressive. And, you know, the feedback I get on all those is there's some good things, there's some not good things. It's mixed, right? But that's very loose and very anecdotal, and that kind of feedback doesn't help you at all. I need to talk to them and get some specifics as to what specifically is doable and what specifically is just not really functioning well.
Okay. You know, we can look at the total amount of waste that's being disposed of in the region and have a very good handle on, you know, what's happening at the residential side of things. However, it's the commercial side that probably would need better data in order to develop better programs.
Yeah, and that's the hardest one to get the data on. You know, if you're doing a residential collection program, and as Rob mentioned, you know, when they collect the city of Sugar Land, they got a truck dedicated to a route, and they can figure out how much recyclables go in that truck. They can weigh it, and they say, but you know, City of Sugar Land, here's your data on how much recyclables we collect. When you're running front end loader trucks down Long Point Drive in West Houston, and you're picking up, you know, every other, every third, every fourth business, and some of them have recycled containers and some of them don't, and some of them don't have space for recycled containers and some of them do. Getting that individual number is going to be really tough. Getting an aggregate number may be a doable thing. Rob mentioned some really high-tech technology with, scales on front end loaders and all that kind of stuff. That's not cheap. Those aren't easy conversions. Those aren't cheap conversions, and the calibration and monitoring. That's a tough target. I think you can get gross data easier than you can get, how many commercial trucks, for instance, collected how many tons. That's the data I think is easier to get.
When,
Well,
and Chuck, oh, go ahead, Mike,
Go ahead.
sorry. I was just gonna say, to follow on to that, how easy would it be, or how much pushback would there be from these, 100 different haulers that are licensed to just be able to share with the city, here are the businesses that do have we are collecting recyclables from them. So just as a starting point to try to get some kind of idea of how many businesses are even already doing this, even if we're not getting tonnage data. The city's got a database of every business license in the city that we could then compare it to. Here are the businesses that actually have a recycling program.
Let me throw an interesting. It's a small curveball, but let me throw you an interesting curveball. We have this problem when we collect fees. About the only thing we can go on as far as locations of a business is their zip code, right?
Right, so you don't even have the street address of the name of the business?
Well, we have the street address and the zip code, but knowing whether it's in the city limits or not is difficult to tell. We know which zip codes are in the city, but some zip codes span city boundaries and they go into the county and they don't. And it's, you got to have, it takes a lot of work to pinpoint every single one and say you're definitely in the city boundary or you're not in the city boundary. Not that you can't do it, but the easy out is to just use zip codes. But when you do that, you got a built-in extra.
It's interesting. I just wonder if there's a way between, and again, it's, it takes people to do this and everybody's short-staffed in every area. But if there was a way to just, from a database standpoint, look at what the city has as far as business licenses for businesses and then compare it to where the haulers are saying, yes, I am offering recycling, and try to, kind of reconcile those two lists and get at least some idea of how many businesses are already doing it. Even if we're not getting at the tons, just to get an idea of the universe, of how big of a lift is it to have every business doing some kind of recycling. And obviously the type of business and the size of business makes a difference. And, the city's already reaching out to those small businesses anyway. So I think I'm just curious of how we can get a better handle on it. So that was why I was wanting to ask if that is a big ask of the haulers or not. Mike, I think I cut you off. Were you about to say something else?
No, it's fine.
It's fine that I cut you off. Okay.
All right, no, we're good.
Okay. Any other kind of either big picture thoughts on, technical assistance beyond just the haulers, and we appreciate the haulers weighing in on this, but anyone else? I think we've got maybe representatives from multifamily. What are your thoughts? I mean, do you agree with the sentiment that enforcing a mandatory on multifamily may be good, bad, or ugly?
Hey, Allison, this is Bradley with the Houston Apartment Association. And I'm sorry I had to step away for a little bit, so I don't know if this has been covered or not, but I know the word cost has been thrown around a bunch. And for us, I get a phone call from a media outlet at least 2 times a week asking, needing information and asking why rental rates are going up. And we all know, everybody on this call knows everything is getting more expensive, but there is without a doubt an increase in cost for rent, and that goes to a variety of factors, including and maybe the largest is property taxes. And I know personally, my property taxes haven't gone down in the last 8 years, so they're only going to continue to go up. And I know that we can be prisoners of the moment. We can look at the fact that we're all spending $5 a gallon in gas. But that said, when you talk about making it a mandatory program and putting it on the backs of the residents, because we can also be honest, these are pass-through costs. Whether you're building a single family home and the price of lumber goes up, the builder's not going to absorb that price. So that's where, we need, I'd like us to consider that when we start thinking about mandatory or incentive-based or voluntary programs, that you know, we'll be thinking about putting this on the back of residents who, in some cases, can't afford it to begin with. So, you know, and we've got a wide variety of properties from A to D, and you know, and anecdotally, some of the stuff that I've heard, and I may have one person on here. I know we have another person that represents larger multifamily footprint who wasn't able to be on today, but you know, depending on the type of property you may hear, and some of the haulers I'm sure have heard it too, like we want this, we want this, we want this, but then the actual participation is not so large and makes it, you know, kind of cost inhibitive. So I just wanted to throw that out and make sure that we consider that, you know, while what we're striving for will help, you know, the community at large, I think that if you go to certain people and you knock on their door and say, well, you know, your rent's going to go up, even if it's $10 a month, somebody may say, well, no, I don't actually want that recycling. So can I save that $10? So, you know, and again, that's simplifying how this all works, but I just wanted to make sure that we kind of keep that in mind.
I think that's a fair point. When there's 8.5% inflation, it may not be the moment to start band-aiding new things, but I hear your point that whether it's mandatory or voluntary, it's going to cost something. And if that gets borne by the residents of the multifamily complex, we need to keep that in mind too.
Bradley, this is Mike. Short of mandatory, you know, when you look at some of these other city programs, which ones do you think have the potential to work best in Houston?
You mean going on Allison's presentation of what other cities has done?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to look at that more, Mike, and kind of talk through some of our folks. And really what I want to do now, and Allison, I really appreciate you providing that today. And I can't wait to take a look at it and actually go to some of our members who are operating in San Antonio and in Austin and in Fort Worth to kind of see how that has worked out and what they are doing there. Again, you know, some of the people that are doing that and some of our owners and managers that are doing that are large, they're statewide, they're national, they might be international companies. So, you know, this stuff they may be able to incorporate a little bit easier. And I'm not, you know, saying that it is easy, but then some of our smaller local owners who only operate in the city of Houston or only operate in our, you know, in our region and have a smaller footprint as far as property. So, Mike, I can't answer that question just based on the last, you know, 45 minutes of this, but I've taken some notes and I really can't wait to actually get the PowerPoint so I have a chance to, you know, kind of share that with some of our other members.
Okay, and I know we'll have a session on multifamily with you and some of your members talking about this. And I do want you to, you know, think of it in terms of, you know, if the city were to, you know, significantly delay mandatory, you know, what steps could be taken other than mandatory to get more reduction in recycling from that sector?
Sure.
Okay, we've got some hands up here. First, Richard Johnson again. Sir.
Yeah, I just want to follow up with Bradley's point in thinking about cost, and I think we need to, you know, when we say mandatory, you know, the first thing that jumps out at me in terms of cost is, well, what materials are we talking about collecting? Because that really changes the economics. I mean, you know, we have 3,900 students who live on our campus. And I can tell you hauling away their solid waste has always been a cost, right? So, but I can also tell you in that history, hauling away the cardboard and paper and metals has sometimes not been a cost. Sometimes it's been a source of revenue. It gets more complicated when you throw in the glass and the plastics and things like that. So, you know, depending upon what materials we're talking about, we may be talking about less cost or no cost. So I think it's sort of, you know, we need to be cautious in how we approach what are we including in mandatory, and then figure out what the financial, you know, impacts and risks can be.
Okay, great. And next up is Ben.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, thanks. One thing I'll mention that we've seen in other communities, Chuck definitely represented some of the challenges that we've seen when, turning mandates on, but not necessarily having the right infrastructure or the support needed. One success we've seen in a couple different areas where we've had these regulations implemented is actually kind of a go-between between the large haulers. So, and people might call them valet waste services or something like that, but there is the opportunity for either, small businesses that exist to get involved or new small business opportunities. I'm sure Republic and other large haulers may agree. We don't necessarily want to be going into the multifamilies to every door. And so I think a lot of people think of the only solution for multifamily is a front load container outside of that multifamily. If you have a volunteer program, and again, the financial aspect plays a role. So if some residents in a multifamily or in certain multifamilies are willing to pay a nominal fee for that valet waste collection, typically when we move to multifamily commercial collection in cities that have mandates but don't have the infrastructure in place, we see those valet waste companies as the first ones to get in there and actually our first customers in that space, just because it can be done on a 1, 2, 5, 10 resident thing. And it's not an all or nothing for an entire building. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, great. And next, Director Mark.
Yeah, okay. So I'm glad I got a chance to hear from Bradley on that because, really, and my question is, if the apartment owners, multifamily unit owners don't have to share the entire brunt of whether it be a mandatory or strongly encouraged recycling program, how amenable do you think they'd be to, maybe a shared investment? So in other words, if you have the municipality providing some technical assistance, maybe you don't have to pay for the containers or any sort of rental fees or something like that, and maybe there's some shared expenses in there. Do you think it's a little bit more palatable for some of these areas, or are they just going to look at it as, oh, we got to pay, this is more on top of
that? This is totally off the record. So,
yeah.
But I think what you're saying there is that sounds kind of more, and incentive wouldn't be the word necessarily, but it could, so I think whenever you have those added benefits brought in, I think that naturally makes it more palatable. Of course, everybody's initial reaction to anything like that is, oh my gosh, no, wow, we can't do that. But I mean, I think if we look at something that down the road eventually might be mandatory, if we start these discussions and we can actually have honest discussions about it and kind of work through some of these details, Director, I think that we would be open to it. And
okay.
I may have some members that would say, Bradley, what the hell are you doing? But I mean, let's be honest at where we are.
Well, and the other thing I think it does is it really kind of helps people understand the true nature of recycling. Right? So it's not just, you collect a can and you go get money back. There's some expenses that are involved in it. And I think that if the municipalities are willing to ease that impact by way of, because if I'm a private company, I'm going to want to amortize the cost of my containers, my equipment, pay our employees and all of that. But if I can take care of the equipment, and you don't have to worry about having that cost passed on, and it's going to make that rate a little bit more appetizing. And I believe that's something that we as municipalities or people who have the capability to ease that impact should do.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
If I can tack on to that, Bradley, since we're putting you on the spot a little, maybe when we do talk more about multifamily, I'd be curious how many residents in the multifamily are saying, hey, single family gets recycling, why don't we? Like, is there a call for it, or is it, and that obviously that can vary by complex. So I'm not asking you to answer for everybody, but is there any kind of general sense? Because what we heard from San Antonio is that the reason they went that route really was more about expanding access to make, what services are provided to multifamily line up more closely to single family. And so it was more about a fairness in the services that are offered. So I don't mean to take away from the cost, because I think the point you made is very good on that. But I'd be curious if there is any kind of push for it on the part of multifamily, like, hey, why don't we get this because single family does?
Right. And yeah, that will be something that I'll be asking. And it has been stuff that has been a question that I've asked to a handful of some of our larger owners and operators. And and just anecdotally, they don't see a lot of that call, and some of it, and in some of the A properties, they will use that as, hey, look at, this is an amenity, right? I mean, some people are moving into these high rises and they're spending a lot of money on a month on rent, and here amongst the pool and the parking and et cetera is another amenity that we offer, and then the participation is very low. Like in some one of our largest operators managers told me that maybe 20% in some of those, those are just individual properties. So yeah, but again, this is stuff that I'm going to be taking back to our members and trying to get as much information as I can.
Yeah, and I would imagine that the more affluent complexes would kind of expect concierge or valet service, so they could be setting it out at their door just like they would a single family home. But that's not going to be true at every complex.
Right.
And then larger ones may have, maybe it's worth looking at for the city for any kind of new multifamily that's being built, that they are accommodating recycling collection in more frequent areas, to have it set up to where that could be part of it. But for the complexes that have already been there for a long time, just the logistics are a challenge. So I hear you. There's a lot of different angles when it comes to multifamily, because there's a mixed bag of what those complexes look like, what the residents expect or want, and what they can accommodate.
Right, and that even goes back to what you said. Fort Worth has mandatory, but they have an opt-out. And I'm not saying, and because of what you said, one of the things on the slide was because in some cases it's just not doable.
Exactly.
All things to consider.
Yeah, I would say any good mandatory ordinance is going to have exemptions, right? Of any kind. You want to make sure that you're realistic. But so I think that if we even went that route with Houston, I think we would need to accommodate exemptions or exceptions.
Yeah, and again, we'll have time to dive into these multifamily issues a lot more at one of our future meetings. So I appreciate your input, Bradley. It's been helpful.
All right, thank you all. Am I off the hook?
You're off
for
the
now.
hook today.
For now. Yeah. But man, I'm ready for that discussion. I'm telling you, you can hear it in my voice. I'm ready.
And let me just wrap up real quick that we will make the PowerPoint available. There is a report that isn't quite finalized that I think Mike, we would also make that available to this group as well, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the PowerPoint itself, I'll make sure Keith has that so we can get that out to everybody. So you'd have all the links to, the sources that we put in here, and you'll have this information. The report will follow.
Okay. Elise Coffey, I saw your hand up earlier. Did you want to say something?
Just briefly, we've had some limited experience in neighborhoods where we try to advertise a drive-through recycling type event. They have been very marginally successful. So in looking at opportunities going forth with multifamily, that might be something we could expand for some types of resident apartment, multifamilies that don't have space for carts or dumpsters or whatever. Just a thought.
Great. All right. Okay.
Appreciate everybody's input.